So, welcome, Michael Fanning. You've had a long career in communications and PR and a rather fascinating 6 years in sustainability. And we are very grateful you'll be sharing your experience with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Janice. And it's a pleasure to be with you and with your students. And congratulations on the new book that you've co-authored with Larry Parnell. It's a super book, and I commend it to everyone in the PR and sustainability profession.
Well, thank you for that wonderful response. I appreciate that very much. So, Michael, students, I've made Michael's a full bio available to you. So I just now want to give you a short, brief introduction. Michael Fanning directed sustainable development for Michelin, North America, in 2015 and 2016. Before that, he had spent 5 years directing sustainable development for the Michelin Group in its global headquarters in France. Prior to his time abroad, he had spent a decade here in the U.S. with Michelin North America as VP of Corporate Affairs, responsible for corporate communication, government affairs, and media planning and buying. So let's begin, Michael. You were a communications professional for a number of years, as we know, before taking that assignment in France as Global Director for Sustainability. Can you tell us about the challenges of such a transition were for you?
Sure, be glad to. Well, as you mentioned in that brief bio, I had worked for a number of different corporations in what I would call the classic communications area. I had worked for IBM for 10 years. I worked for Reader's Digest, and I'd worked for a number of other firms. And I had done a lot of internal and external communications. When I came to Michelin in 1999, one of the things that impressed me about the company is that they were very open to people having career changes. Now, a lot of corporations give what I would call lip service to that. And they say, yes, we're willing to let you explore other areas, but quite frankly, they really want you to focus on the area where you have the most amount of experience. At any rate, as an example, at Michelin, I remember there was a gentleman who was an engineer, and he had a very successful career in engineering, but he went on and he actually went into human resources, and it eventually became the head of the Michelin Guide in North America. Now, that's quite a transition for somebody who was an engineer. At any rate, I had a very successful first 10 years at Michelin. I was very fortunate. As you mentioned, I was director of corporate, or vice president of corporate affairs, and it was classic. It was internal, external. Then I had some government affairs responsibilities, as well as media planning and buying, working closely with our marketing units. And then 10 years into that stint, I got a wonderful opportunity to move to France and to head up the Global Sustainable Development Program. Now, as a bit of background, Michelin, a European company in terms of where it was founded, but obviously a global company in the way it operates, was very focused on sustainability. There was a program early on called Michelin Performance and Responsibility, where Michelin really said, listen, if we're going to be a well-performing company, we're going to have to perform in two areas. And one is a classic financial, customer-focused company. But the second part is we have to be responsible in the way we operate. And so the company, from its very early days, had a true focus on conserving natural resources, treating people appropriately, and really being a good steward of the planet Earth. So I was really fortunate that this particular opportunity came my way after, a huge career in classic corporate communications. So arriving in France, what were some of the challenges? Well, I had to get acclimated to the language. I had had language training in French in high school and a little bit in college. And then having worked 10 years for Michelin in North America, and working with a company that had its headquarters in France, there were a lot of documents that came my way in French and the opportunity to improve French. But quite frankly, moving to France and having to operate only in French was an extreme challenge for me. I found it difficult. I found it frustrating. I would revert sometimes to English, but I could tell that my French colleagues wanted me to speak in French. My staff was totally French. They liked to experiment and practice their English with me, but quite frankly, they would revert to French when they had a real point to make. So that was probably the first and really most difficult challenge for me, was as a communicator and someone well-versed in the English language is trying to use that same facility in a new language. So I did my best. I took a lot of courses. I forced myself to watch French TV, go to French movies, and just constantly speak French. The second thing was a real cultural adaptation to the French people. One thing that it is very clear to me after having lived there is that you really need to develop relationships. And you hear that often wherever you go, that relationships are important and it's important to develop them. But there, I think it takes it up a bit, just a notch. And you find out that being invited to someone's home for a Sunday lunch, which could last for 6 hours, going to a play with someone, meeting their family, there was a lot of attention paid to developing relationships with people. And I found that by doing that, I really had a better chance of success in my job, because once people knew you on a different level, there was more openness to communicating with them and to getting things done. I would also say that there was a real cultural adaptation in the way the French worked in a business environment. And I'll give you one example. I would go to a meeting, let's say in the United States, and a meeting in the United States, if it was supposed to start at 10 o'clock, it started at 10 o'clock. And if it was supposed to end at 11, it usually ended by 11. And there were a series of actions that were developed as a result of that. I found in France, it was different. If a meeting was supposed to begin at 10, it might begin at 10:15. People would wander in. Sometimes the agenda would work. Sometimes it evolved into people talking over one another and expressing different points of view. And at the end, sometimes there were no conclusions. And it was really frustrating to me. I thought, well, I'm never going to get anything done in this environment. But I found that after a while, it was the free flow of information and the exchange of opinions that was most important. And that things eventually would come to a conclusion, but it was really important to have that free flow of information and to allow what I would call a non-structured meeting to evolve. And that was difficult. But what I found was that people who went to France and experienced that and came back to the United States were actually more effective because they had found ways to operate in a different environment. And as a communicator, it was difficult at first, but I learned to love it. I guess I would end this particular portion by talking about the importance of my sustainability training. When I first arrived in France, I didn't have much of a background in sustainability. I knew about the Michelin performance and responsibility approach, but I didn't really know how to proceed from that particular point to the new approach that they wanted me to develop. And I think what was important for me was developing a relationship, first and foremost, with a group called the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's a group headquartered in Geneva, and it's mostly European companies, but with a smattering of US and Asian companies that are really focused on the sustainability area. And I found that by going to those meetings, I was made the liaison delegate for Michelin. I found that I was able to acclimate much more quickly to the sustainability requirements that were going to be so important for me to be a success.
Well, that was quite interesting. Very much. I'm wondering, it's interesting to know how you got into the how you oriented yourself into this new situation in all the different aspects. But once you were oriented and once you were really focused on the work, how did you and your staff manage sustainability? And particularly, what was important about the communication approach?
Yeah, as I mentioned, first of all, I had an entire staff of French people, Benedict, Sylvie, and Patrice. And it was quite interesting when I first came on board. There was a little bit of, well, what can this American teach us? We've been doing sustainability here, and here is somebody who's rather a novice at it. And I think it took a while for me to acclimate to them and them to acclimate to me. And I think the thing that I was going to bring to them was sort of a blank tablet where I didn't know exactly where to go. And so I was open to all sorts of things. There was no precondition to how I was going to operate. So the first thing was acclimating to the French staff and having the French staff acclimate to me. Second thing was I really determined that the best way forward would be to interview the chief executive officer as well as his top level executives and find out what they were looking for. And I found that those executive interviews were really helpful to me because I found that the current program was good, but that it had no real connection to the outside world. It was really more of an internal Michelin focus on sustainability, but they were lacking that outside perspective. And let me give you an example of how that manifested itself. One of the areas that we were interested in obtaining a certain objective was the Dow Jones Sustainability Index Award. So there's an award that is given to companies throughout the world from Dow Jones, and it's considered sort of the top award you can get in the sustainability field. So I worked very hard on that, and I found out one of the key requirements to get this award was to have a stakeholder perspective. And that was not only in discrete areas, but it meant having an overall stakeholder approach where you would invite people to come in at least on a yearly basis and to discuss the approach to sustainability and to get the stakeholders' perspective on it. Well, this took about 2 years to get going to the point where the executive team agreed that this would be a good thing to do and to align ourselves with the proper number of stakeholders. So we had our first stakeholder meeting, and I think it was in 2013. I had arrived in 2011 in France, and we invited a number of European stakeholders, and it turned out to be a resounding success. As a matter of fact, our CEO said to me at one point, it was like having 25 experts in the room for free. And it involved a real, these were suppliers, government people, customers such as BMW. And it was one of those breakthrough moments, not only in terms of our sustainability approach, but obviously in terms of communications. Because not only did we align ourselves with 25 people, but they felt really tied to us. And later, when we started to get more mature in our sustainability approach, some of these people became key proponents of helping us in our way forward. So that's one example of how we use communications and how sustainability was enhanced through an outside perspective. I mentioned the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's a very important organization in the world. As I mentioned, it's headquartered in Geneva. Excuse me. And I was the liaison delegate. And I found out that many of our customers were also members of the WBCSD. So I was able to work very closely. I had mentioned BMW. I was able to work very closely with them and develop a good relationship. And they helped me think about some of the things that we needed to be doing at Michelin in order to improve our sustainability approach. A third element is I hired a group out of London called uniquely Sustainability, with a capital S and a capital A. And it was one of the first consulting groups in sustainability. And they were probably at the time considered the best group in sustainability. And they helped me with a lot of research, a lot of networking with different people to understand what were sort of the sorts of things that we could do. So what did this all result in? Well, after about 2 years, I proposed a new structure at Michelin. We had a sustainability council that was chaired by our CEO. I had a group of people that reported to me among the business units that became sort of a consulting group. And then we developed, through this network of people reporting to this sustainability council, we developed 6 ambitions for the year 2020. And it was a very interesting process because at first, some people were a bit reluctant to commit to some very difficult goals. On the other hand, I think the team pointed out that if we didn't commit to some very difficult goals, that we wouldn't have a really robust sustainability program. Some people might accuse us of what's called greenwashing and just having a very sort of a very modest and not very strategic sustainability program. So we developed 6 goals for the year 2020. We felt that this is in 2013. We felt that a 7-year horizon was probably appropriate for obtaining these goals. And these goals were around product performance, energy efficiency, sustainable financial performance, employee engagement, employee safety, living in harmony with communities, and finally, sustainable mobility. Now, on that last point, sustainable mobility, I might point out that one of the communications areas that was most successful for the company was actually started before I came to France. There was almost a yearly program at Michelin called the Michelin Challenge Bibendum. Now, Bibendum is a nickname for the Michelin Man in Europe. And there's a long story behind it that I'll tell you at some future point. It's kind of interesting. But the Michelin Challenge Bibendum was an annual roadshow in sustainable mobility. And my team in North America, when I was in North America, helped create a Challenge Bibendum 2 times in California, once in San Francisco and once in Sacramento. But the program moved around the world. It would go from Paris to Rio de Janeiro to Chengdu in China. So one of the things that we were able to do is use this forum to promote our sustainable development goals. And it was also a way to integrate our sustainable development with a number of other companies. That turned out to be a huge opportunity for Michelin. Another example is COP21. Don't know if most of your students are aware, but the United Nations runs on an annual basis something called the Council of Parties. And it is an opportunity for all world countries to get together and talk about sustainability targets. So in 2015, COP21 was held in Paris. And because Michelin is a French company, we were able to go to COP21 and talk about some of the targets that we were creating to help advance world sustainability. And I'll just give you one example in that area. Anyone that has a car has tires. And one of the things that is most remarkable about tires is their effect on fuel efficiency. Most people think that fuel efficiency is more a matter of your motor or the way that you use your gas pedal. But quite frankly, about 1/5 of the energy efficiency from a car comes from its tires. So Michelin had figured out a way to use silica in its tires to reduce what's called rolling resistance. And as a knock-on effect, Michelin has as a goal to save 3 billion liters of fuel over the lifetime of its tires, thus avoiding the emission of about 8 million tons of CO2. And so we were able to go to COP21 and promote energy efficiency through proper use of tires. And this turned out to be a huge public relations opportunity for Michelin to talk about how other tire companies could possibly use the same approach that we were using to fuel efficiency. And maybe I'll close this section before I have any questions from you, Janice, on one anecdote that kind of sums up the opportunity that we had at Michelin and how it worked. When I first looked at the sustainability approach, I was part of the communications function at Michelin Group. The more I thought about it, I realized that sustainability really needed to be integrated into the strategic approach of the company. So I suggested to my boss and to our CEO that we move the sustainability program from the communications function to the strategy function. I said because it would have a quicker uptake from the business units if it were embedded into the strategy of the company. And after about 3 or 4 years, that's exactly what happened. I actually changed bosses and had a new boss in the strategy function. And I remember him coming to me one day and saying, you know, Michael, we have this goal that we're trying to reduce emissions. We're trying to make our supply chain much more efficient. I understand all of that. He said, but now you've proposed that we be the first company to have a sustainable natural rubber approach. And he says, that's going to cost the company money. Do you think the payback is going to be there? And are our competitors going to be able to eclipse us in terms of financial performance as we're trying to do something that's good for the planet, but maybe not so good for our bottom line? It was an interesting question. And quite frankly, having the director of strategy posit that was quite a challenge. One of the things I pointed out was, look, we may be the first people doing this, but perhaps by doing this, we're going to show our customers that this is the approach to take. It's the right approach to take. It is in keeping with our sustainability guidelines. And while it may cost money, there are things that we're going to have to do that simply are the right thing to do. And we have to find ways to conserve money in other areas. I don't know that he took that to heart, but it was interesting because here's what eventually happened. We came out and had a sustainable natural rubber production goal. It was a well thought out process. We teamed up with the, what was the name of the NGO? It's got the panda. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's the, well, anyway. It turns out that once we developed this particular program, I came back to North America, and one day I got a call from General Motors. And General Motors said, Michael, we'd like to have a call among the key tire manufacturers to talk about sustainable natural rubber production. You're the first company to do it. And our CEO, Mary Barra at GM, has asked us to consider doing it for all companies. So once I took the call, it turned out that after a while, GM was going to force our competitors to align to our point of view with sustainable natural rubber production. And I found out probably a month after that happened exactly what had happened. It turned out that the NGO with whom we had aligned had a person on its board of directors who also happened to be on the board of directors of General Motors. And that particular person took the Michelin approach from the NGO, brought it to Mary Barra and said, I want GM to follow the Michelin approach. So what I had foretold to the director of strategy at Michelin came to pass. It turns out our competitors had to follow us, and we took something that could have been a competitive disadvantage in one respect and turned it into a huge competitive advantage. So I hope that helps. I would give you maybe 3 or 4 other little nuggets in terms of communications. When we first developed our 6 ambitions to the year 2020, we had a global rollout. It was in Paris, and we invited all the countries to come to Paris. I was actually part of a dramatic skit that was proposed by the group. They love to do sort of creative things in order to get across certain points. So we did some scenario playing on the stage about sustainable development, and that proved to be very worthwhile. The second thing we did was we had a monthly focus on some aspect of sustainability that all of the countries around the world had to promote within their countries, whether in newsletters or in communication forums with their executives and things like that. So that was to keep the focus on sustainability. I developed a network where there was a singular person in each country that was responsible for sustainability. And that was not only the rollout of sustainable development within their country, but also the communications of sustainable development. So working closely with their communications function. And then I will just finally maybe sum up by saying the fruits of the sustainability program were that we won the Dow Jones Sustainability Index Award in 2015. So all that hard work that we did resulted in, I think, something that the company felt very proud of. So I hope that helps. And if there's anything you'd like me to expound upon, Janice, I'd be glad to do it.
Oh, I think that helps tremendously. You've given us so much detail, Michael, and we're going to have some fun discussing all of the elements that you offered to us.
Sure.
And what I really think is that you've given a lot of students a blueprint on how to initiate sustainability at their organization and how to manage it. So it's very, very valuable that you spent the time to share that with us. I do have just one small follow-up question,
Sure.
and we'll say goodbye.
Sure.
Looking forward, do you have any advice for those still in the classroom, us, studying the connection between PR and SR sustainability?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, when I first arrived in France, I found that the connection with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development was really extraordinarily helpful. They've got a robust website. I think it's wbcsd.org. And you will find in there just a wealth of resources in terms of connections to different companies, different reports, initiatives that they're undertaking. And I will tell you, I work closely with the WBCSD. This is rather interesting. I'll just give you this little side tip. The WBCSD had its own mobility project, and I led a 3-year program in Chengdu, China, to help the city of Chengdu improve its sustainable mobility. And I was aligned with companies like BMW, Daimler, Volkswagen, Fujitsu, all of whom are members of the WBCSD. If students are interested, for example, in interning or possibly a job in sustainability, they really should go to that website, take a look at the members. Let's give a quick example. Take BMW. You know, could it be interesting to look at a company like that and say, where are its operations in relationship to where I would like to work eventually, and see if you get an internship at one of their locations. I know a number of students that have done that, where they've looked at the different companies and said, hey, these companies I know are already well integrated into sustainability because of their alignment with the WBCSD. And hooking up with them through internships really can lead to employment. So I hope that helps.
The interview you've just seen featured Michael Fanning, former sustainability director for Michelin.